One of the most important things that we can do is to talk about addiction and to talk about substance use struggles in general, to destigmatize them.
Yeah.
Speaking personally, one of my major barriers to getting help with my substance related problems was a lot of shame, a lot of stigma. And I think it's important to highlight how, not only is this a very common problem today, but that it's stretched back for thousands of years, literally
Mhm.
thousands of years. And there's a community and a fellowship of people who have struggled with addiction for so many years in human history. So it's really crucial. It really is life or death to be able
Mhm.
to talk about and to share insights about addiction today.
I'm really interested and excited about what we will be able to cover in, in the next minutes or so. I run through your book. I'm extremely interested in some of your thoughts, ideas, and experiences, personal and professional. So I hope I'll try to get the best out of this conversation and do it in English too. So it's a double challenge for me.
I'm sorry for that.
Yeah, no, we'll do okay. Um, to start with, I'll try to run through some of the questions that we prepared in order to try to get a good link. Um, could you introduce us to the subject of addictions through the comprehensive study you've conducted on this history, on this book, on your experience?
Yeah, I'd be happy to give a taste at least. I think the most important thing to say at the beginning is because I suffered from addiction and because I'm still in recovery from addiction and because there's a lot of addiction in my family, it felt really important for me to understand what addiction was. And that's what motivated me to get a clear sense of what are we talking about? What are we talking about when we talk about addiction? And if somebody is wondering if they have addiction or wondering how to change, I think they need to understand what addiction is from a starting point. And there's a lot of different lessons that I learned from the history, but I think I'll just start with one really important one, which is nowadays, I think it's common in medicine to have a very narrow perception of addiction. People talk about it as if it's a very small portion of human society
Mhm.
and it's only the most extreme sufferers, when in
Mhm.
reality, back throughout history, looking back at the early Christian theologians, looking at the Greek philosophers, looking at Indian Hindu texts, people recognize that addiction was universal. It's something in all of us. And out of that fundamental idea, we get a lot of other lessons about how societies can better manage addiction.
Okay. Now, I read in your book too that the fact that it's throughout the whole history that we find addiction. Now, my first question there would be: is it getting worse, or is it that we know more about it? There's more light regarding addiction. Which of both? I mean, is it getting worse, or we're tending to look more at it, and therefore there's more light regarding addiction in general?
I think it moves in cycles. I think it's a very important question because we have to know where we are and what our trajectory is. And
Mhm.
I think at this point in history, we have many, many opportunities, but we also have many challenges. Some of the opportunities are the medicine is much better. We know a lot more about psychotherapy. We have we have medications and pharmaceuticals that are actually helpful and useful for people with severe addiction. And we are every day developing more wisdom and more science and more practice about how to better um, help people toward recovery. But there are challenges too, because I think any casual observer recognizes the way that they're powerful forces that can increase the risk of addiction. And
Hmm.
I don't want to create villains or to be overly simplistic. The addiction is very complex, and it comes at the
Yeah.
intersection of many different forces. But there are powerful industries, if we're talking about the opioid industries or the alcohol industries or the tobacco industries, or even everyday addictions like the use of smartphone, and there are certain harmful elements of um, social media, perhaps. And those don't come from nowhere. Those are connected to um, powerful industries that sometimes play an active role. And those two things are working in concert. That we have many advances that I think are very helpful for people with addiction, and also a lot of wisdom that's helpful for people with addiction. But there are also major challenges in 2023 that people in prior years didn't face before.
Okay. Why is it important that we speak about addiction, and what are the main issues today regarding addiction? What should we put more attention towards? First of all, talking about it for sure, getting a broader view, like you said, not a narrow view or a narrow perspective on it. Mainly speaking about legal and illegal drugs and alcohol primarily, but why should we speak about it, and where and why is it an important issue today?
Yeah, I want to say first that I'm grateful for your interest in this topic, and I'm really glad for your time and for the curiosity you've shown about it, just on behalf of people who are in recovery or struggling with addiction. Because I think one of the most important things that we can do is to talk about addiction and to talk about substance use struggles in general, to destigmatize them.
Yeah.
Speaking personally, one of my major barriers to getting help with my substance related problems was a lot of shame, a lot of stigma. And I think it's important to highlight how, not only is this a very common problem today, but that it's stretched back for thousands of years, literally
Mhm.
thousands of years. And there's a community and a fellowship of people who have struggled with addiction for so many years in human history. So it's really crucial. It really is life or death to be able
Mhm.
to talk about and to share insights about addiction today. That's a really difficult thing, and that's why we need stories. I think we need good policies and we need good science, but we also need people to step forward and share their stories about addiction as well. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to do that today.
Good. We'll try to help or to walk towards that. I mean, people talk about it. I'm sure it helps, and I struggle myself with one addiction too. Probably not as hard as others, but food addiction is also a pandemia, and it's defined
Yes.
in those ways today's throughout the world. Now, going a little bit deeper regarding, or one step deeper regarding addiction, could you help us understand the difference between a person who is addicted and a person who consumes potentially addictive substances, either legal or illegal? Because I think there's a lot of confusion there, or we tend to treat it all as the same. And I think you can put some light regarding that those differences. You know, how people that walk near the addiction related, or in using potentially addictive drugs, alcohol itself, and those who are already addicted. How do we set that boundary? How do we find that, or where do we find the line in between both?
Yeah, it's an important point. I'd be happy to speak to it. But if you don't mind, I would like to ask you first, if you mind telling me just a bit about why you call your food addiction an addiction. What made it an addiction for you?
Probably because I couldn't set the limit regarding what was reasonable to uh, eat or not, and I needed it, and I probably found, I still probably find uh, things that are not directly related to the food in itself, but uh, feeling myself better, more happier, connected to others by sharing that food. I mean, it's not only getting the energy I needed and the nutrients I needed of the food in itself, but all that's around the food in itself, and not being able to set a limit on where to stop. I'm handling it better, uh, but it's a constant struggle.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. I mean, I think that is a good explanation of where addiction lies for a lot of people. It's the inability to control,
Okay.
the attempts to control, and yet not being able to control. There's an example I have in my book about ancient Greek philosophers talking about trouble with willpower and the will, and modern philosophers have likened that to, say there's a piece of cake in the fridge, and you say to
Mhm.
yourself, I don't want to eat the cake. And even so, you watch yourself walk toward the fridge and then you eat the cake. Uh, that's a very
Been
common
there,
experience.
been
That's a
there, done
universe.
that. Yeah.
And me too. I don't struggle with alcohol. I don't use alcohol. I don't use stimulants anymore. I don't use cocaine. I don't use other stimulants. But I can still struggle with, say, eating ice cream. And that, to me, it's not threatening my life today. If it got out of control, it could certainly threaten my life, right? I could have major cholesterol problems and blood pressure and obesity and all the rest, but it's still the same process. It's still the same psychological process. It's still the same human process. And I think that is the mystery of addiction. That is really the key point of addiction. Getting back to your question, the key point of addiction is that mystery of self control. How is it that I can't do what I intend to do? Why can't I do the thing that I plan to do? Uh, and a lot of people throughout history have encountered that sort of gray area where it's not like they're sleepwalking. It's not like they totally lose control of their minds, but they feel like their choice is impaired and they lose the power to set a limit, or they lose the power to control their behavior. And that's a big difference than, say, somebody who just uses a harmful drug and they
Mhm.
experience some harm. Maybe that's also a problem. And maybe that's also a problem that medicine can help with in certain ways. There are ways that we can reduce the harms of people who use potentially dangerous drugs, but that is not necessarily addiction in and of itself. Even people who use heroin don't necessarily go on, not every single person goes on to
Mhm.
develop an addiction. And so the drug policies are not the same as addiction policies. They're two different
Okay.
categories.
Okay. Now, stepping away from the fact of the individual in itself, I would like to move towards analyzing the effect that addiction uh, can have on a family itself. So um, the addictions can drive families to despair. They don't know how to treat a family member who's addicted, uh, how to handle it on an everyday basis. How can relatives help? What can families do? Probably what we're sharing now together will be viewed by many members of family who struggle with these not only addictives but their family members. So can you give us a path or some ideas, or how can we help them? How can they help their relatives?
Yes. Yeah, it's such an important question because people really feel the hunger to do something to help. And I felt it myself when I watched my parents struggle with addiction. And, sometimes it can be so frustrating and it can feel like hopeless. Even when my mother was dying of cancer, I watched her drink in a way that sort of undercut the chemotherapy drugs that were trying to stop the cancer. So there can be lots of problems with addiction family members all the way to the gates of death. And it's important that families not only get clear about what is helpful, but also take care of themselves in the process. We need both. It's like you need to have your own oxygen mask on
Mhm.
in order to put on the other person's. There are good principles for dealing with people and loved ones who have problems with addiction. There's also a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of sort of tough love, punitive approaches. I think it's natural that people think that punishment might be motivating. Maybe if I get tough with a child, or if I get tough with a family member, maybe that will shock them in a way that wakes them up. And that's really not true.
Mhm.
Really strict coercion actually does not change people's behaviors well. We know that well from psychological research. It's a complicated subject, and I think the thing I want to say the most about it is that there's help available. There's professional help. There are psychologists and doctors like me and others who are trained in ways
Mhm.
of helping family members to cope. There are groups, there are educational resources. Um, there's one psychotherapy. I don't know if this is too specific, but there's one psychotherapy called CRAFT in
Mhm.
English, CRAFT,
Yeah.
and I'm
Craft.
pretty sure it's been adapted to Spanish. But
Mhm.
it's a modern psychological principle that it just has some basic, straightforward guides to helping someone to help discern the boundaries between what is too much, and when do I establish healthy boundaries, and how do I make a decision about when to withdraw care, like withdraw help possibly? These are very, very complicated questions. There's no
Mhm.
simple answer. Some people say, oh, you have to cut them off and allow them to hit rock bottom. And it's just not
Yeah.
true. That's not what the science shows. So then if you're not going to do the simple thing, then what do you do? That's harder. That
Yeah.
takes some real care and
Yeah.
concern, and it can be useful to get help with that.
Okay. Now, something that I want to uh, take from what you just said, that was really important for me. There's we have to take into consideration and be more or very uh, helpful towards the addictive person in itself, but also on the effect uh, on the family, on the, that family that surrounds them. There's an effect on them too. That that idea of getting your oxygen mask before helping the other is that's very enlightening for me. But because sometimes we tend to put a lot of attention on the person, on the addicted person himself, and we tend to forget on the effect that it has on the whole family and the health, the mental health, and the emotional effect on the overall family. And that's an area I would like you to reshare more thoughts. Uh, there's probably a lot of members of those family looking at this, and there's a way to help them too.
Right. The first thing to say about that is that if you have a family member who's struggling with addiction, it often feels very lonely, but you're not
Yeah.
alone. The statistics say about 10 to 15% of the population struggles with a substance use disorder. That's probably
Okay.
a bigger percentage when you count in things like serious gambling or the other types of behavioral addictions. And the experience of suffering with a family member is sometimes isolating, and people sometimes hide. Sometimes because of the stigma, they feel shame. And it's important to know you're not alone, and there are support groups and there are professional opportunities for help. So that's the most important thing I would say, is that it doesn't have
Okay.
to be a solitary endeavor. Uh, and
Don't
it
get
really does.
isolated. Don't. Okay. Search
Yeah.
for help. And there's others that are going through the same, and it's not your fault.
Yes,
can we use that word too? Because
absolutely. Yeah.
people tend to feel very responsible of what's going on. What did I do wrong? Where did I made a mistake?
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's too simplistic to say it's somebody's fault or
Yeah.
addiction was caused by this or that in a family relationship. It doesn't work that way. What addiction is very complicated, and we don't know in 2023 exactly why some people develop addiction and other people don't. There are risk factors. There are genetic risk factors and there are chemical risk factors and there are other psychological risk factors, but it's nobody's fault. It's not the
Mhm.
parents' fault. It's not the spouse's fault. And actually, one of the most therapeutic things we can do is to take the blame out of
Okay.
addiction.
Mhm.
Uh, Once you get past the blame and you start asking what is most helpful now, what is most helpful to the whole system, to the family
Mhm.
system, then we can do a lot of good.
Good. Uh, One of the things I noted on your book is that you tend to put a lot of responsibility on the citizens, on each one of us citizens, not only in government, but we are all part of this, of what has to be done. But in spite of that, uh, I have a role and I have a responsibility. So I would like to understand what is the role of government to help people with addiction? What should we do, and what do you think are suitable lines of action in matters of prevention, not only on helping one that's already addicted, but only also on prevention? What as moving forward as government,
Mm,
what would you tell us to do? Where to put some more efforts? What are lines of work you think are successful or are being successful elsewhere?
yeah, I'm honored that you would ask, and I appreciate your attention to it because I do think that there are things that governments can do to help. And so, two big topics are how can governments help with harmful substances today, and
Hmm.
then there's an even bigger second question about prevention, which is how can we help future generations. And the first one is a bit simpler. The first one is about what do we do about potentially harmful substances?
Hmm.
And I think that we can be um, a bit reflexive in uh, assigning good versus bad to different substances. Some substances are called bad, like cocaine and
Hmm.
heroin, and then they're treated as if they need to be completely eliminated. But prohibition doesn't work very well. It's very hard to completely prohibit things. We do need, of course, reasonable regulations, but holding on to some fantasy that we could somehow eliminate every single drug from a jurisdiction is impossible. It'll never happen. But by the same token, we give drugs like alcohol a free pass, and alcohol is a drug too. It causes a
Yeah.
tremendous amount of pain, tremendous amount of violence as well. And I think one of the most important things for governments to do is to find that wise middle ground in between total laissez-faire, free for
Hmm.
all on one hand versus really restrictive prohibitionist crackdowns on the other. One of my favorite drug policy research called it grudging toleration. It's that,
Hmm.
we have to tolerate it because it's a part of human life, but we do so grudgingly. We do it in a way that sets limits that hopefully minimize the harm. Now, to the second point, what do we do for future generations? I think about this all the time because I have a 7-year-old son. And I think about what is going to set him up for success and minimize his risk of, say, developing an addiction. And how do we think about uh, the long-term effects 5, 10, 20 years down the line? And I think the most important thing to say about that is that uh, the best kind of drug prevention is really providing for people's human needs. We like to have these feel good interventions like having a lecture at a school or some sort of like commercial, television that says avoid drugs, and that stuff is fine. Maybe it helps a little bit. It's a
Hmm.
worthwhile thing to do, and if you do it in an intelligent way. But really, like, you're swimming upstream if you haven't established like opportunities for meaningful work and housing security and food security and a safe place in safety in our cities and in our communities. Like those things are essential, and there's no point in sort of putting the icing of feel good messaging on top of fundamentally unstable situations. Like addiction is really a problem of the whole human. It's not
Mhm.
some simple technical issue that we can address in isolation.
Okay. So you told me that you've got a 7-year-old son. I've got three myself, 24, 22, and an 18-year-old, uh, two male and a girl. Um, and let me walk you through something that's happening almost on an everyday basis, or at least on weekends in Argentina. That I'm not sure it's common elsewhere. You probably know better than me, but I would like you to explain exactly what I'm talking about. In Argentina, it's increasingly common for very young people, even minors, to drink high grade distilled beverages like vodka or gin, or in Argentina, we've got one that's called Fernet, that's also 40 degrees uh, of alcohol. Uh, but with the objective of strictly to get drunk before going out to dance or going out partying. And families, knowing that this has happened, have tend to establish the fact that that happens in our own homes before going out, because at least we feel that we got them more secure, more safer. But that happens on a weekly basis. It's Fridays or Saturdays. Is this common elsewhere? Is it common that, that they use alcohol to get drunk, to be happier, to have a better time? Is it common that happens in our own homes? And what do you think about this? What do you know about this elsewhere?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear about the Argentinian experience. That's my casual understanding of nightlife in a lot of places can be oriented toward binging, but not everywhere. So that's an important point. Is that binging is not necessarily normal, and binging has a medical definition. People for men, for example, it's more than 5 drinks in a drinking session over the course of a night. And sometimes in, say, New York City, you tell a 25-year-old that, and they say, that's ridiculous. If I start drinking at 2 p.m. and I go out with my friends later that night, of course I'm going to drink more than 5. And so I think it's important to convey and to be clear in our messaging that binge drinking is not healthy. It's not good for health outcomes, and it isn't good for our mental health. And I experienced that myself when I was growing up as part of the United States university culture. In a lot of universities, there's a lot of binging. We can see it a lot in Britain. People talk about binge Britain, or the pattern of binging in the United Kingdom. It's not a human universal, and so I can certainly um, identify with the parents who are wondering, given that this is going on, what should I do? If they're going to go out and drink anyway, I might as well do it in our house. And that's a complicated scientific debate, actually. People have discussed whether, for example, here's an analogous case. People have discussed whether introducing children to uh, moderate levels of drinking earlier in their lives might actually help them to learn how to drink safely. And there's evidence, honestly, on both sides of the issue. There's some evidence that says, if you normalize it and you don't treat alcohol as if it's some sort of special and dangerous situation, then you can perhaps encourage more healthy drinking habits and encourage moderation. But then there's some other evidence that says very simply, the later you give your children alcohol, the less likely they are to develop alcohol problems. And obviously those are incompatible. It's hard to
Yeah.
tease those out. So in 2023, we don't have some sort of very strict scientific rationale. But personally, I favor toward, I think sometimes we, just in general, we shy away from uncomfortable topics, and it's good to bring it out in the open and just be very clear. And this is binging. I'm concerned about it. I don't think it's healthy. I see this and that. I see that, when you go out on the weekends, you come back very drunk, and I know it seems like everybody else is doing it, but really, it's not good. There are ways that individuals and families and communities and governments, I think, can convey that message. It's not a magic solution, but it is an important piece of the cultural understanding of drinking problems.
I want to go back a couple of steps or topics before asking you last question. Is when we talk about addictions and we talk about addicted people, and we're not only speaking about the extreme illegal use of drugs, but also there's the, the softer use of it. And I want to go through that again, because if not, we're only speaking about what we can see on a very marginal situation, or an extreme, like a Walking Dead type of people in our bigger cities, and but it's a broader, it's a wider spectrum of situations, and I think that that's important, because especially middle class tend to think, well, that's not happening to me. My son is not addicted. I am not. Look at them. They are. No, they can't even walk throughout the city. But it's there's more of us inside that situation. So I would like to go through that again, because I'm trying to go wider, and tend to help more people understand what we're going through, and that we're all part of it in a certain way.
Yes, it's such an important message, I think, and I think it encourages compassion. One of the most important parts of, say, for example, a family member helping someone with an addiction is compassion. You don't need to be tough. You don't need to punish. You don't need to establish consequences.
And
Compassion is actually very therapeutic and healing. And the same thing holds true for us. The tendency is to say addiction is a big problem. I don't have it. I don't want to have it. I'm going to defeat it. I'm going to go to war with myself, and I'm going to conquer it so I don't have to worry about myself. And that actually is not a helpful way to approach the struggles that I think everybody has. Sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, but the answer is not war. The answer is not war against ourselves or war against the addictive part of ourselves. The answer is to really greet it with compassion, and then find a way of working with it, sometimes strictly, but sometimes very gently. And so once we accept that there is this universal character to addiction, that everybody has some kind of struggle with control and willpower and all the rest, I think that opens up the space for all of us to be compassionate toward ourselves and toward each other. That's my hope, at least.
well, first of all, thanks for your time, for the love you put and the knowledge you put regarding putting more light on addictions and helping people. And before uh, finishing, I would like you to. It's a tricky question, but I would like to ask you, uh, if you were a member of a government and they gave you the ability to implement one action, just one, to mitigate the effect of addictions, why would you do? What would you do, and why? Just one. You've got the whole power. It won't happen. It doesn't work that way. That's why it's tricky. But
It's tricky because it depends on the situation, and I'm still curious about Argentina, and maybe I'll learn. Maybe I'll visit one day, and I'll get to learn more about the local context. I can tell you, for example, in the United
you should.
States,
Hmm.
the one thing I would do would be to establish better healthcare coverage, because we don't have good healthcare coverage, and the overall picture of healthcare is part of not just physical insecurity, but financial insecurity. Last I checked, it was the leading cause of bankruptcy in the United States to have medical bills. So it really depends. It really depends on what the society is calling out for, and it really depends on what the society is struggling with the most. In the, I guess leaving the United States aside, the thought that comes to mind right now is treatment. You know, treatment is not one size fits all. It's not the perfect cure and all the rest. But consistently, many societies have undervalued the role of treatment. Treatment can really help. Psychology, medications, if it's done well, if it's implemented well, if there's high quality training and education, then I think we often undervalue the way that treatment can serve people, just like we've been talking across the whole spectrum, not just the sickest, but to destigmatize all people who struggle with substances and to help them find better ways of coping.
Okay, so before thanking you finally and waving goodbye, there's something you would like to tell us, share with us that I haven't asked, something that you feel it's important to communicate?
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to say thank you. I really do appreciate, and as someone in recovery, I'm grateful for your attention to this important issue. I think just the fact of having a discussion is really important. And the one thing I want to highlight, I guess, at the end is that we'll never see the end of addiction. It sounds pessimistic. I actually think it's optimistic. If we live in the fantasy that we can somehow end addiction and solve addiction, then we're trapped. We're stuck doing futile things or chasing after impossible outcomes. But if we open up to the fact that addiction is a part of human life, then that allows us to let go of the harmful attempts to conquer it or to cure it or to otherwise dominate addiction. And if we can come at it with a place of acceptance and care, at the individual level, at the social level, and all the rest, whether that means harm reduction, like syringe service programs, or about treating people who use drugs with human dignity and respect, or whether that means just in your household, coming at somebody with compassion, even while you're trying to help them to change, that is actually a much more harmonious way of living with addiction rather than trying to squash it.
Well, thanks a lot. I hope a lot of people enjoy and learn from your book here in Argentina. I look forward for you traveling to Argentina and get to know better what's going on here in Buenos Aires City, and sharing our experience with all your thoughts and knowledge and goodwill and love that you put in this fight against. Fight is not probably the best word, but this cultural aspects of addiction. So thanks a lot, Eric. I've really learned reading and sharing this conversation. I really wish that this conversation will help a lot of people, at least help them to speak about addiction and sharing it with others, and putting some light and feeling less shame about it. If we can do that, we've probably done a lot.
Well, thank you, Minister. Again, it's an honor, and I'm just so grateful for your care and your attention to this topic. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it with you.